What's going on, y'all? It's KMBest, your favorite 69th ranked Marvel Snapper, here with the top decks in the Marvel Snap metagame. It is the final few days of the season, so people are going to be trying to complete those infinite conquests and trying to climb onwards and upwards to infinity and beyond. So please enjoy the show. For me, I think this metagame is actually pretty balanced. There are a bunch of different decks that I think are legitimately worth playing, and then several other decks that are legitimately worth respecting. So I'm going to start with the one that I played most recently, and then we're going to go from there. These decks are in no particular order, just, how recently have I played them, how often have I played them, and this one is a new version of the Anni Bounce archetype, and I believe it was played by Dott.Geo, a high elo player. I have that secondhand. I got it off of Untapped.gg, but I believe I was told that this list came from that person, and I think it's a sort of natural extension of the Anni Bounce archetype that I had a hand in spreading the gospel of before the Werewolf by Night nerf, and I know people are still going to be looking for Werewolf by Night decks, and this is actually a legitimately good one for Werewolf by Night fans. I think it's one of the few decks where Werewolf by Night is still actually good in the way he was previously, and it should be familiar to anyone who's looking for just a comfort pick that liked playing those bounce decks. This is the best we can do now. It's unfortunate, but it's true. So if you enjoyed playing those beast bounce decks, yes, we do have to make the sacrifice of including Zabu now. It is unfortunate. Yes, we do have to play Enchantress now, thanks to the overwhelming popularity of the Living Tribunal, which is actually the most played deck after Infinite since the patch, which is absolutely insane. And of course, there are the normal strategies that this deck has that did not get hurt. Things like using Sentry into Annihilus, getting a zero-cost hood out there, generally attacking your opponent's board while also presenting a strong, proactive game plan with your bounce cards. Now, this is still a pretty skill-testing deck. A lot of the reason why it's a little bit worse now than it used to be is because your free win draws are fewer and farther between. Your free win draws with this list used to be things involving Black Widow, which we can no longer afford to play, in my opinion. You can try to get her back in here, but I don't think it works. You no longer have those one-drop Black Widow beast instant wins. They are no longer there. You have to work for your wins, but luckily you are still good at doing that. Zabu and our discounts allow us to make very explosive final turn plays involving multiple 0-cost 1-cost cards and multiple 3-cost 4-cost cards. Jeez, that was a mouthful. This is still a legitimate deck, and I actually have been playing it a ton recently. I might even do a guide to this on Tuesday. I'm not exactly sure, but if I can find time in my schedule, I probably will do a more in-depth video on it. You didn't think I'd get through a tier list without talking about Loki, did ya? I do think that the best version of Loki right now is this build that totally abandons ever even trying to win the mirror and just says, you know what, I'm just going to have a very coherent and powerful game plan. I'm using some of the best cards in the game. Arguably the best card in the game outside of Loki, Miss Marvel, has become a ubiquitous threat across the metagame, and taking advantage of what is powerful is kind of Loki's best trait as a deck. He morphs to fit what already works well. When a bounce shell is very, very powerful thanks to Werewolf by Night, he can work in that. When a Elsa shell is very powerful thanks to Elsa, Kitty Pryde, and Jeff, he can work in that. And now that the best stat stick in the game is a 4/5 ongoing, well, he can work with that. And that is what this deck is attempting to do. One of the things that you'll want to pay attention to in this list is how often Nick Fury is actually good. Because for me, he is easily the worst card in the deck, and I have thought long and hard about whether to have Nick Fury in the build that I show you here or Mobius in the build that I show you here. Honestly, I think that Mobius is probably better, but I have not made the change myself, and so for that reason, I'm not going to recommend an untested change in this deck. That said, I do think it is likely that Mobius is better, not only for mirrors, but also in the case of decks playing Beast and decks playing Zabu being as common as they are. In addition, Mobius gives you some real range against decks like Living Tribunal. Because they are so reliant on cards like Ravonna and Sera and Wave and Zabu, you can actually just shut them down without needing to be an Enchantress deck. that is an important aspect of why I'd want to include him as well. Here's where I think I might surprise some people. This is a build of Lockdown from a high elo player called Sizer. I do not know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And he has been using it to great effect. It leaked out on Twitter recently and I took notice. This is a very, very powerful thing to be doing right now because, again, it relies very heavily on Miss Marvel, and that is a very strong thing to be doing, but also because with the loss of Professor X, you end up in a situation where the best lockdown card is Storm, and Storm is a pretty damn good card as long as you can avoid some of the early scaling threats. And since so many decks, like Loki decks, are really only running one early scaling threat, the Collector, you put the Storm in a different lane, and they end up not having a lot of great fours to play onto that lane. You can win that lane, you try to get ahead, you try to play Alioth, and they absolutely die. Alioth is a lot of why this deck still makes sense. It is one of the few decks that I can actually think of that wants to be an Alioth deck as well. And you will also notice that it continues to use the pattern of abusing taking priority. Miss Marvel really helps with that by including Negasonic Teenage Warhead. She's not as good as Alioth, she's mini Alioth, and she's amazing with Storm. When Negasonic first came out, the Storm Negasonic thing was something people talked about and tried to make work, but it hasn't really had its time in the sun. Storm Negasonic right now is extremely, extremely powerful, and you should be aware of the kind of damage it can do to your opponent. This deck also, in addition to having a lot of power, has a lot of power that moves. Silk, Vision, Jeff, these are all things that you can use to make it so your opponent does not exactly understand what's going to happen to them, and you can generate these situations where they overthink into just getting Alioth, and those situations give this deck some additional cube equity. The Sera Tech deck, pioneered by Revis and then highlighted by Cozy, is one of the decks that I think people are really picking up on right now. It's not so common as to be much worse than it already was, I think, but it does have some intricacies that, when people know exactly what they're facing, make it a little bit easier to play around. That said, it is still an extremely strong deck, yet again, a Miss Marvel deck, and I do think the thing that people miss about this deck for the most part is that while it is a deck that overloads on tech, it is also a deck that puts all of its power into a very compact package. You have Lizard, who, by the way, can be Jeff if you want. You have Miss Marvel, you have Gladiator, and you have Maximus, and most of the rest of the deck is not actually going to put a lot of power out. So you do have these situations where your opponent is reasonably able to look at what you could possibly do and say, I can be better than that. Now, one thing that I think does not, or is not apparent at first glance when you look at this deck, is just how reliant it is on Miss Marvel in order to have a coherent game plan. Yeah, the tech stuff is good, but when you're in those matchups where the tech cards aren't particularly doing anything, when you're in those matchups where you are kind of holding a Shang-Chi and an Enchantress and just hoping you get a reasonable target for them, Miss Marvel is going to be how you win those, and her being a 4/15 is incredibly important. Please spend the entire game playing as if you might play a Miss Marvel on turn 6. Do not drop 2/2-drops in the same lane unless you are very sure you are not going to need Miss Marvel to put power into that lane. It is incredibly, incredibly important. Another intricacy of this deck is because you are a Miss Marvel deck, you are going to want to put up situations where they cannot rogue your Miss Marvel profitably. That can mean putting Miss Marvel in the Lizard lane, it can mean putting her in the Mobius lane, what have you, but you need to use your ongoings to protect your other ongoings from rogue. This, of course, however, makes Enchantress a little bit better against you. So figuring out what your opponent is likely to be on is very important in terms of figuring out how you deploy your ongoings in order to minimize the possible damage from either Rogue or Enchantress. Thanos is still chugging along. This is the Human Spiders build of Thanos, although I will say he is playing Mobius and Mobius instead of the Leech. I have opted for Leech along with Lambie. We have both opted for Leech here, but I don't necessarily have any objections to playing Mobius. I think it's actually probably totally fine to do that. I personally prefer the certainty of Leech. I like that existing. I don't like Mobius being my only real ongoing threat, enabling my opponents to rogue it and get rid of it and things like that. I don't enjoy it, but I do think that this is definitely a deck that still needs to be respected. It is still extremely powerful to play a gigantic blob. if you can make sure you have already won one lane, that is one of the most guaranteed wins you can get in the entire game. Now, the nerf to Professor X has definitely hurt Thanos. You are a weaker deck than you were. It is very tough to come to terms with that because you were so set as this Prof X steal lane, win game kind of deck. But I will say, I'm not even sure it was so much the nerf as it was the insane rise in Miss Marvel, because now, we've talked about this a little bit already, but now that Werewolf is gone, Miss Marvel is the best stat stick in the game, and so she ends up going in way more decks because decks are now being built around her, and that means that you, as a deck that is trying to leverage Professor X, are in a really awkward spot a lot of the time because Thanos, because it's a deck that plays Infinity Stones, can't play Miss Marvel. And so Professor X might have even gone out of this deck, even if he wasn't nerfed, because of the increase in Miss Marvels running around the game right now. Still, Thanos is a solid deck. If you've played Thanos previously, you probably can still play it. Lockjaw is an unfortunately necessary addition, and I will say I'm very excited for what this deck may get in the upcoming season with Kyera and Scar. For more on those, check out my video on the data mined, not confirmed, new cards for next season. I consider Leech Hawk perhaps the most underrated deck in the game right now. I don't see as much of it as I should. It is an extremely powerful strategy. Leech is genuinely great in a ton of situations, and Leech Hawk is what is allowing the Hawk archetype to continue doing what it was previously doing, which is be good into almost any spot. Now, Leech was originally included in this deck in order to deal with blobs, which are admittedly a lot less common than they were when that first change was made. However, it's become just like a genuinely good card into, say, turn 5 Lokis, because when you look at the deck that you have, not a lot of it is good once it gets leeched. And that's an interesting sort of counterplay option that we have as well. Of course, the main thing that makes this deck be what it is the wide variety of tech cards that you can play. The suite that I've chosen is here to cover as many options as possible, but that's not to say it's the only version of the deck you should consider. There are about 4 tech slots in here, and each of them deserves to be covered in some amount of detail. So there are definitely plenty of things you can swap out. Maybe you're running into a lot of ongoings and you need more ongoing tech. Do that. Don't sit here with a Shang-Chi if it's not doing anything for you. Maybe you're not running into enough stuff that Mobius is good against, although I find that unlikely considering it's good against other Zabu decks, it's good against Beast decks, it's good against Loki decks, it's good against Tribunal. I think that's a little unlikely, but hey, what do I know? You can feel free to swap that out as well. Killmonger, even, if you're not running into a bunch of Thanos decks or Bounce Loki decks where you can actually get the Killmonger off profitably, is a very easy card to get rid of. There are plenty of options that you can choose. For the 3s, you can try things like Black Widow. You can try a different tech card for the 4s. You could also try a different tech card for a 3 slot. You can maybe play an extra 2-drop in here. You have a million options to customize this to what you're seeing. However, I will give you the advice of not being too reactionary. Now, what I mean by that is don't lose one game and then change to a card that would have won that game. You need a wider sample size in order to figure out whether or not the changes you're making actually make sense. Take your time, think about it, and then make changes to this deck. I do not want people picking up this deck, changing 3 cards because they lost 3 games, and then having something non-functional. Please, please, please take your time and figure out how to mold this deck to the metagame rather than being too reactionary. She-Naut is still just chugging along, and I actually think this deck is pretty good right now. It has a minimal amount of wildly overpowering predators, and it's in a spot where you can actually use things like shocker surprises to scam cubes off of people, which is why the shocker is in here instead of Cosmo. However, this is a deck I really wanted to start revisiting in the potential event of Kyera coming out, because it does seem like a deck that would benefit heavily from her. Still, I think that this is a very underrated and powerful deck, but it's definitely not for everyone. This list I got came from Nalguidan, a former Hearthstone Grandmaster who plays Marvel Snap some of the time and is generally someone I trust on how to build certain decks. Now, he's been a big believer in this list for a significant portion of time. He plays it, basically this list for like a month now, and I do think it's probably the best build of She-Naut in my humble opinion. Now, the reason for this is that Cosmo is simply not doing his job of protecting your magic because you are in such danger against a rise in legions, which of course Revis brought back to the meta with the Sera Tech deck. And of course, there were also some people playing Legion and Thanos. Like, you're gonna run into that splash hate just from people trying stuff. And Legion is probably the most common way of getting rid of a location, and Snow Guard is the second most common way of getting rid of a location, which means Cosmo isn't doing anything to stop either of those things. That's the shocker inclusion here. Like, this is a deck that doesn't actually have a 12th card that it really wants. So we get the shocker, we get our freebie, sometimes it hits the Hulk, sometimes it hits She-Hulk, and then we can explode on turn 6 and they won't expect it because they'll be expecting us to be a magic deck or be unable to make a play like that. And I think that's pretty cool. It's a solid deck. I think everyone mostly understands how to deal with it. Your good hands are the ones where you have a lot of 1-drops, then you can follow up those 1-drops into a turn 7 30 power play, and that's pretty much the deck. Next up is, of course, the deck that everyone is scared of to the point that it might not be a threat anymore. This is Living Tribunal. Now, I was shocked when I checked the stats on this deck. Obviously, it's a good deck, but I didn't expect it to be played as much as it was. From ranks 30 to 100 plus, it was the most played deck. Past rank 100 plus, it was still the most played deck since the patch. And I think that really speaks to why it is no longer as dominant as it was when I first did the video on it with Hela and Joyer. Now, that's just pretty simple. This is a deck based around saying, do you have it? And once that video came out, a lot of people had it. When a deck like this becomes the most played deck in the metagame, the counters for it proliferate through basically everything. You see more Mobius, you see more Rogue, you see more Enchantress. And yes, Mobius and Rogue alone are not enough to make the deck bad, but if every deck is playing either Mobius plus Rogue or Enchantress or some combination of the three, this deck's in a really bad spot. Now, another thing that is hurting it is just how predictable it can be. And that's part of why I think maybe it's just not being played exactly correctly. Because one thing I'll notice really good players like Hela and Joyer do is do these setups like Sera into Onslaught and then explode on the final turn of the game for cube equity. And I don't think those have fully caught on among the wider player base yet. But this is a deck that has fallen from being one of the best decks in the game when it was a surprise to pretty mid now that it's not a surprise. You do need to still respect it, but you also need to understand when you whip this thing out and they have the counter, you are so dead. So dead. The most dead. And you're going to lose like 8 cubes on that. A lot. It's a good deck, but it's more about the threat this deck creates in the other decks in the metagame than it is about this deck at this point. On to the honorable mentions. This is Hela. You know what she does. You know what this deck does. And the basic premise of this deck is we're just going to do as much as we can to have about an 11 out of 12 chance at having the card Hela. And that's what this deck is really doing. Now, we do have the ability to play Black Knight for, you know, if we want to do some Ebony Blade stuff. I've actually seen some pretty cool Black Knight builds recently. Like there's I believe an Asian player playing Black Knight Sera, but I have not played it personally. And to me, it looks like a very similar actually to the Revis Sera build. It's just using a different package for power. So I assume it's actually pretty damn good. I'm not sure if it's a better execution of that strategy than, weirdly, the Revis Sera build, which is doing a similar thing, but with more tech and a bit less power and a little more reliability. Now, one thing that this deck does, though, is go over the top of stuff in a way that they're just simply not prepared for, right? So you think about that Revis Sera deck, I don't know what it's supposed to do about this. It just kind of dies. Like, if this deck does what it wants to do, it does absolutely nothing. Like, there's nothing you can do about Hela when it does what it wants to do. And I think there's actually a bit of an argument for this deck being more dangerous than it previously was because so much tech space in the metagame is being used up on making Tribunal decks bad. Just having a deck that's like, yeah, I'm going to put like 40 points on the game in the final turn of the game, 40 points on the board even, is pretty dangerous. And because you don't know where those points are going to go, you're often in these situations where you're just like, well, I think I just have to leave. And Hela is a great deck at forcing people to leave. Hela has probably the strongest snaps in the entire game, and it is definitely something that you're going to need to leverage in order to get good cube rates out of this deck. Is if you're not snapping aggressively on your good hands, you're going to really run into trouble trying to climb high with it. Honorable mention number 2 is this Ronan Lockdown build. I think the Sizer build is a little bit better, but what this deck does is give you some really solid pick one or the other gameplay at the end of games. You get to do things like decide to go very tall or decide to go very wide, and that playstyle means that this deck is a very easy one to pick up. I think it's a fairly solid alternative to the Sizer build, and I wouldn't be surprised to see them at roughly the same level if they both were able to be played at the same level, but I am not sure how to phrase this. I think this deck's a little bit easier to play, is basically what I'm getting at. This deck has more free wins in it than the Sizer deck does, and I think that that is likely to give it a little bit of benefit, because most of the people watching this are not going to be playing that other deck at the level a Sizer is. And so while I do think the Sizer deck is probably better if you fully understand what's happening every time you queue up the game, I think this one might be a little more forgiving, which is why I've included it on the list. For more, you can check out the video I actually made breaking down this deck in depth if you'd like. Finally, Destroy's on this list as like a legacy pick. It's the honorable list of honorable mentions. This is the Detroit Pistons. They're technically an NBA team, but like, yikes. So this is a deck that has gone through many stages in terms of why it's good then and why it's bad now. But I'm going to give you about 3 reasons for why. Reason number 1, all the combo decks go over the top of it, and even Loki goes over the top of it now. Miss Marvel is a card that is extremely powerful, and this deck can't play it. Reason number 2 is that this deck is a lot better in early metagames because it's the same 12 cards. You know what a Destroy deck looks like. So you play it while everyone else is figuring out what their optimal 12 is, but the later the metagame goes, all those optimal 12s get figured out, and you kind of get run over. Reason number 3 is Tribunal and the consequences of Tribunal. First of all, you can't beat the Living Tribunal deck, you just die to it. But second of all, because of Tribunal, people have added in a lot of tech that can incidentally blow you up. If you're going for something along the lines of a turn 5 null in order to get a Zola off, well, you better have priority, because if you don't, they're going to rogue your null and you're going to die. And that's a big reason why I don't actually have Zola in here, but like, there's a lot of just incidental stuff that you get hit on within this deck where it's just like, oh my God. It's a deck. I would say it's a deck that probably has a positive win rate and a minimally positive cube rate. It's just really hard to recommend. All right, y'all. I hope you enjoyed that look at the top decks in the Marvel Snap metagame. I hope it was helpful for you. I know it was actually helpful for me just going over all of that, thinking about everything, making it make sense, and I think that this is actually a very wide open metagame, so good luck in your infinite conquest and in your final climbs upward into the infinite ladder. As always, it has been a pleasure. Thank you so much. I've been KMBest. I will see you in the next one.